Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, together with my wife Eileen. I can't quite see her at the moment. She'll wave a hand. She's over there. She's the lady with a red jacket. She's very friendly. She doesn't bite. And I love coming to the States. We've got many friends. I'm sure as a result of this weekend we're going to make many more friends. I want to thank Father Tim very much indeed for his many emails and his helpfulness, and got a huge appreciation of what's going on here in Columbus with all the churches, the Episcopal churches. We've never been to Columbus before, and I see that in the boardroom there's something that says Columbus is a place of wide avenues and good sanitation. I'm especially delighted with the second one. So it's a great pleasure to be here and to share some thoughts about the Middle East. What's going on there? I'm going to be quite provocative in what I say, because I love the American attitude of why not. And the criticism is not going to be directed at the United States, I'm glad to say. It won't be in that kind of attention at all. But what's happening to the Christian churches in the Middle East? Because the revolution is going on there, and all of us ought to be concerned about it. We're talking about the link between Britain and America. There's a lovely story going around in Warwickshire. Warwickshire is a place where Shakespeare was born in Stratford, and apparently in the church, I think it's Holy Trinity, so that you identify that immediately. Trinity here, Trinity in Stratford-on-Avon, that an American visitor visiting Shakespeare's church said to the verger, "Sir, could you direct us to the washroom? To the restroom, I should say, to the restroom." To which the English verger, who was not as familiar as I am to the word restroom, said, "Well, sir, we don't actually have a room dedicated as such, but you may use any pew you like." I'm sure the verger was suitably informed what restroom really meant. Well, Eileen and I visited the Middle East on many occasions, and still continue to do from time to time. I did my national service. I was in the Air Force, so when I was a young man many years ago, I served in Egypt and in Iraq, and got to know wonderful, gentle people. But what's now going on in the Middle East is quite horrifying, destabilizing, and worrying. In a recent visit to the Middle East, the Pope expressed worries that a third world war might start there. And Jeremy Bowen, who is a BBC Middle East correspondent, commented in this way: "A third world war? Maybe the Pope is right. Right now, in the Middle East, there's a war going on wherever you look. In recent times," he said, "I've reported from Damascus, Aleppo, Baghdad, and Gaza. Everywhere, war. I haven't had time to go to Libya," he said this year, "which is already a failed state by any definition. It's being sliced and diced by tribal and Islamist militias. In Yemen, separatists have advanced to the gates of the capital. In Egypt, the government now elected, but directly descended from the violent military coup that seized power from the Muslim Brotherhood last year, is fighting jihadist insurgency in Sinai. The latest war in Gaza will not bring a long-lasting ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Lebanon is feeling the heat from the war in Syria. Syria's war has spilled over into Iraq, creating a bigger explosion by mixing with its homegrown sectarian violence. The rise of Islamic State is sending the war in Syria and Iraq into new, even uglier phase. The way life used to be seemed now distant. The Syrian end of the war that began with an uprising by demonstrators, the tangled and deadly mess of rivalries and alliances. The war is made of several smaller wars that sometimes run in parallel and sometimes cross over like railway junctions on the express to hell. The response to IS, led by the United States, will graft another layer of war onto the ones already existing. The horrific execution videos put out by Islamists seem designed to provoke a military response from the West. Their calculations seem to be that Western bombs mean more recruits in the West as well as in Muslim countries. IS might be right if the military operations being planned by the Americans and their allies end up being seen as the latest battle in a Western war on Muslims. Just last week, our Parliament in Britain agreed to join US and France in airstrikes, as though that's now continuing. And in the chaos of what is happening, the courageous Christian churches are being threatened in a way wholly unlike anything that's gone before. We need to bear in mind that most of the ethnic churches in the Middle East can trace their existence back to the formation of the early church. And that reminds me of an anecdote by Bishop Rhea, our bishop who's retired now, but he was Bishop of Jerusalem about 10 years ago. And he was once asked by a British person, when did you convert to Christianity? To which Bishop Rhea said, well, about a week after the resurrection. And the Christian church there can proudly claim that they've been constant and they've thrived in all the troubles since those days. And most of these churches belong to the great tradition of orthodoxy, whether it's a Syriac Orthodox Church, the Syriac Catholic Church, the Coptic Church, the Chaldean Catholic Church, the Maronite Church, Greek Orthodox Church, Armenian Church, Greek Melkite Church, and go on and on. And the church that's under the greatest pressure today in Iraq is the Chaldean Catholic Church, sometimes called the Assyrian Church. And this is what the Patriarch said a week ago. After a month of displacement, the ancient church of Iraq, the Chaldeans, is becoming extinct. He went on to talk about the murder of individual Christians, of men being taken from their homes and shot, of women raped and abused, of children traumatized. My successor, the present Archbishop Justin, said a moment ago, a couple of weeks ago, the horrific events in Iraq rightly call our attention and sorrow yet again. Christians and other religious minorities are being killed and face terrible suffering. What we are seeing in Iraq violates brutally people's rights of freedom of religion and belief as set out under Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's extremely important that aid efforts are supported and that those who are being displaced are able to find safety. I believe that, like France, the United Kingdom's doors should be open to refugees, as they have been throughout history. The international community must document human rights abuses being committed in northern Iraq, so that further prosecutions can take place. And he goes on to elaborate on that, and that's online if you go into his site. The politicizing of Islam is the key reason why the world is in such a mess in the Middle East. And if we look back, we can trace it from the 90s, when the war was going on in Afghanistan, first against Russia, and then the way that the West, my country, and the United States supplied arms to time were jihadists like Osama bin Laden. We trained them, we exploited their gifts, and then when the Russians left, we forgot about them. And Osama bin Laden and the others then directed their fire against the West. And you remember Osama bin Laden talking about the Americans and the Crusaders, linking, of course, Christianity to the West. And it's very ironic, you know, that following 9/11, extraordinary thing I find this is, in 9/11, aircraft commandeered by that small group of jihadists flew into the World Trade Center, attempting to do the same to the Pentagon and the White House. And that was the day when the world woke up, and for many, they discovered Islam. It's an irony, I find, that within 2 years of Muslims attacking America, that Islam in the United States grew by over 250,000 people. I cannot understand that instead of people being put off by such a terrible thing, something attracted quite a few people to Islam. Why? I would be very interested in your views in the Q&A that follows. Following 9/11, I was asked to do 2 things. It's quite an extraordinary story. First of all, Tony Blair invited me to bring together academics from both the Christian and Islamic traditions to discuss the issues and find ways in which intellectually we can provide answers against this terrorism. Well, the Prime Minister's initiative was a very good one. It continues to this day. What he wasn't aware of, that many links like that were already going on and have been for many, many generations. The one that we started is called Building Bridges, and it's an initiative that's still going on. The scholars meet, but of course it's an intellectual one, academic one. It's not ever going to get down to the root problems. The more important initiative that I took part in was called the Alexandrian Declaration. It started almost directly after 9/11 when Shimon Peres asked me if I would help to bring the religious leaders of the Middle East together. And I agreed to that. And it was building on the terrific work that Canon Andrew White has been doing in the Middle East. Andrew White is a dear friend. We have to be the patrons of his organization. We responded to Shimon Peres and said, yes, we'll do our best. And I was co-leader with Dr. Tantawi, who's the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar in Jerusalem. The fact was that Dr. Tantawi didn't speak English, and English was the working language of the conference. Now, the irony was that we couldn't actually think of any place in the Holy Land where we could have this conference. Because the Muslim leaders couldn't go into West Jerusalem, the Jewish leaders couldn't go into East Jerusalem, and we had to take them out of the country to Alexandria, where we hammered out a wonderful declaration of working together, opposing violence. And that initiative has actually influenced other places, Nigeria and elsewhere. But the failure of that was basically that although we were ahead of the political initiatives, because nothing was happening on the political side, the religious dimension has been largely forgotten. Time doesn't allow me to talk about other similar dialogues with religious leaders in Nigeria, elsewhere, but I want to gather some of the insights from our experience on what is happening today. Let me give you 3 or 4 points. First of all, the important point is this, which is a controversial one. I'm worried that everyone is agreeing to a notion that Islam and Islamic terrorism are 2 different realities. A few days ago, our own Prime Minister said as much in a speech on television. He said that Islamic terrorism has nothing to do with Islam, which is a religion of peace. Well, that is not quite true. But you can understand a politician wanting it to be true. Of course, many, many Muslims, and we have a lot in Britain now, 8% of our population Muslim are good people. They desire peace. They want to live in harmony with people around them. But the uncomfortable truth is this: it's from the bosom of Islam that such violence and cruelty is arising. It's from the tenets of world domination and expansion, from the ideas of the caliphate, from its conviction that eventually Islam will triumph over all the world. Listen to the words of Professor Sam Huntington, an American scholar, a man I met at the World Economic Forum, a very profound scholar who died a few years ago, but he was very close to the truth when he said this: Islam's borders are bloody, and so are its innards. The fundamental problem for the West is not Islamic fundamentalism, it is Islam, a different civilization whose people are convinced of the superiority of their culture and are obsessed with the inferiority of their power. Very, very striking and controversial words. And I remember at the time all of us recoiled from that. We didn't want to say there's an element of truth in it, so we buried it as it went deep down. And so Stephen Huntington is saying that don't blame Islamic fundamentalists. The problem is Islam, the clash of civilization, he called it. Well, I think that the events we've seen in the last 15 years have borne out a great deal of the truth of his words. Just a week ago, there was a peace march through London. The BBC, as far as I know, didn't cover it, and therefore they didn't report the banners that were coming through London. One of them read, "Europe, your 9/11 is coming," and the other one read, "Behead everyone who insults Islam." You see, honesty compels us to challenge the oft-quoted idea that Islam is a religion of peace and love. From the beginning, Islam has been a religion of conquest through war. How did it get to Spain in the 8th century? By taking over country after country. Christianity was wiped out in Saudi Arabia through first forced conversions or death. Christians have only survived in the Middle East by becoming dhimmi citizens. That means second-class citizens, paying a tax, and enforced never to evangelize and baptize Muslims. Now, let me secondly turn my attention to what is happening now in the Middle East as the forces of IS, Islamic State, make their bloody way of murdering and raping. I mentioned Andrew Wright earlier. He wrote this very recently: "I'm almost in tears because I just had someone in my room whose little child was cut in half. I baptized this child in my church in Baghdad. This little boy, they named him after me. He was called Andrew." How can such a barbaric act be owned by any religion? Doesn't such an act of cutting a child in half define what it is to be a human being? We have to also bear in mind, by the way, many of these jihadists in the Middle East, really, although they claim to be Muslim, their knowledge of it is probably pretty scanty indeed. There's a record in one of the London papers that one of the British jihadists, before he left, he bought a book of Amazon saying Islam for dummies. There's a man going to war who actually realised he had to catch up on his reading to do with Islam. And so what's happening in the parts where Chaldean Christianity was very strong, in Mosul, the Islamic State have offered Christians an ultimatum to either convert to Islam, pay a mission tax, that means going back to being dhimmi status again, or face the sword, you'll be killed. Another alternative is get out quickly, and so Christian homes have been painted with red paint with the Arabic N standing ironically for the Nazarene. But it's not only Christians who are being treated in such a way in Iraq. The Yazidi people, which is a really almost pagan people, are also being attacked as well. And one Yazidi woman said to the Iraqi parliament a week or two ago, genocide is taking place in the name of Islam. We are being butchered under the name, there is no God but Allah. But there's a third point, because the question then immediately arises, well, after defeating Saddam Hussein, and all the troops and the US forces who have lost their lives and British ones as well, our forces have left Iraq, we thought this sorted the problem out. What's going on? What's gone wrong? And I want to answer that fairly briefly because I'm sure you have views on this and want to tell me yours in a moment. I think one of the reasons is really it was very limited democracy we imposed. And the question is, can you actually enforce democracy? It has to grow, doesn't it? From the being of people. It has to grow from within us. There's got to be a willingness to realise actually that democracy means sharing views, but also accepting the majority, the will of the people. And Iraq never truly got there. Indeed, one could say when you look at Iraq today, and certainly when Saddam's brutal reign was over, we were left with two competing religions, Islamic religions, the Shiites and the Sunnis, who are now at loggerheads. And maybe the second important thing, that following the removal of our forces, you now have a partisan leadership in Iraq which favoured a particular group of people. And the struggle now is how can we help Iraq to become a democratic country where everyone is respected. So what has happened is jihadist mentality has taken over a great part of the country. I'm pretty sure that you, same as myself, 6 months ago, had never heard of the Islamic State. But gradually these forces have built up in the middle of the country and taken us all by surprise. I want to move to my conclusion so that we can actually have a bit of conversation together. 2 weeks ago, there was a very interesting article in The Spectator, which is a British journal. The article was by a young man called Douglas Murray, and he focused on the beheading. What is this attraction to beheading in Islam? And he answered, I want to quote a bit, he said, but surely one part of the reason beheading is chosen, if not the major part, is the fact that the Quran has verses telling believers in certain circumstances that this is the appropriate way to kill those who are not Muslim. Is not that the important point? What about the fact that the founder of Islam himself engaged in such acts? There were those who say, I'm making this up. So I suppose I better refer people to the sources. And he goes on to talk about that, bringing out statements such as from chapter 8 of the Quran, I shall cast into the unbelievers' hearts terror, so smite above the necks and smite every finger. of them. And he goes on to talk about Muhammad's attitude to one particular tribe of Jewish men of the Banu Qurazi tribe. And he goes on to say, flip through the hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, and I quote this: if a pagan burnt a Muslim, should he be burnt? Of one such a group who displeased Muhammad, we learn he, the Prophet, had their hands and feet cut off. Then he ordered that nails should be heated and passed over their eyes, and they were left in the rocky land of Medina. They asked for water, but none provided them with water till they died. And Douglas Murray goes on to say, is there not a connection between Islam and terrorism we read about today? Why deny it? Because unless we confront it, we will go on denying that Islam has any connection with the atrocities going on in the world. In conclusion, what a sad world we live in. What a sad experience our Christian brothers and sisters are experiencing in the Middle East. We're so safe, and on Sunday morning you come along, I'm going to be talking about the safety, the way in which we in the West have everything going for us, and we don't know what the cost is for our brothers and sisters in the Middle East. And so what we tend to do in the West, we really only partially hear the story. We ignore what is happening outside our own homes. So we turn to other distractions. Let's turn to sport, to television, to books. Let's forget what's happening in the rest of the world. But, my friends, my brothers and sisters, we live in a global village, and sooner or later it's going to catch up with us, unless we do something about it. Professor Sam Huntington, of whom I've spoken earlier, wrote these words: it is my hypothesis that the fundamental source of conflict in this new world will not be primarily ideological or primarily economic. The great divisions among humankind and the dominating source of conflict will be cultural. Nation states will remain the most powerful actors in world affairs, but the principal conflicts of global politics will occur between nations and groups of different civilizations. The clash of civilizations will dominate global politics. The fault lines between civilizations will be the battle lines of the future. His argument should not be brushed aside. And we should not assume that we are coping with the problems and things that are bound to get better. There is no support for that hypothesis. All the evidence suggests that Huntington was onto something, and that argument